Welcome to Consciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome to Consciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, where every week we talk about different dimensions of artificial intelligence and often the intersection between artificial intelligence and public policy, which is why we are so glad to have with us today Janet Haven. She's the executive director of Data and Society, a nonprofit research organization, and has worked at the intersection of technology policy, governance, and accountability for over 2 decades. Hi, Janet. How are you?
Hi, David. I'm great. Thank you for having me.
You may or may not be aware, but we're 19 days from an election in the United States. And, it's got everybody's, upping their dosage of Xanax as we approach that. But regardless of who wins the election, and let's say, we have our hopes here. Regardless of who wins the election, the next president of the United States is going to be involved to a greater degree with AI policy than any president in the history of the United States. And indeed, all dimensions of AI policy, from privacy to safety to competitiveness, to its application in different areas of the government, are going to be central in a way that they've never been central before. And so I don't think at any point in history, when journalists get together and they do the flurry of articles that they inevitably do on the first 100 days of the presidency, where they talk about how do we set the priorities for a new administration. I don't think in the past we've ever really had to worry about what does the first 100 days of AI policy look like. And I just thought, because of all of your work and different aspects of this, you would be a great person to talk to and maybe help us fabricate a few priorities for those first 100 days. How does that sound? Does that sound like something you want to do?
I am happy to talk about that. Although I will not outright disagree with you on 2 points you made, but I will start by saying that I think that the Biden administration has done more than any past administration on AI governance.
No doubt. I certainly acknowledge that.
And I share your hope that the next administration will continue on that path. However, there is those paths diverge. So I think we have already heard from the Trump campaign that there is a lot of intention there to undo some of the work that the Biden administration has already done, the creation of the executive order on AI, for instance. And there's also intention to, bring in much more industry into the questions around overseeing the governance of AI than I think a Harris administration would be likely to take. So I think that it is there is a path under a Trump administration where actually not very much gets done around AI governance and policy making, because that is not, as far as we know, a priority of that potential administration. But in terms of what a 100-day agenda might look like, what are the things that we really want to see an incoming administration focus on? So I think one kind of framing point that I would say is I think it's the right question to talk about the role of an administration, because I think we need to see AI governance happening ideally at the federal level. We've seen some activity, quite a lot of activity at the state level. We just saw a whole raft of bills passed and vetoed in California. But that is going to end us up in a patchwork of coverage, similar to what we have with data privacy laws. So I think it's correct that we really want to be focusing on comprehensive federal activity around AI governance. So things for them to really focus on. So one is continuing the work that has already started. And really that is about building the muscle of governance, of technology broadly and of AI specifically. We are really bad in the United States at doing that. We do not know really how to govern technology. And so we don't have great structures in place. We don't have enough capacity in place. And a lot of what was put forward through the executive order on AI that came out in November of 2023 was direction to the federal agencies to prioritize developing governance around AI in their own areas using a rights and safety framework. And so that has a lot of repercussions about how those agencies are operating and what they are prioritizing, the types of people they're hiring. And that really needs to continue at the pace that we've seen this year, which it has continued to be a significant priority in the agencies. A second part of building that muscle is that we do actually have existing laws on the books and enforcement capacities on the books in federal agencies that have enforcement powers that really aren't being used to their fullest capacity. And so we need to see the DOJ, we need to see the EEOC, the CFPB, the FTC continue to pursue the kinds of enforcement actions that they have started using laws that they have on the books to protect civil rights. The FTC has made it clear that they are going after fraud and deception in the context of AI. And so that kind of robust response using existing law is also going to be really important to see continuing. In terms of new things, there's a lot of different directions that could happen, but I'll just talk about three. So one is, and this is really an undergirding of any kind of AI policy, is federal data privacy protection. That is something that needs to happen, through laws, not through executive action. But it's something that the White House could really make clear is a priority. This is something we, of course, have taken a run at many, many times in the United States, and we have failed to pass comprehensive data privacy protections, and that has put us in a really precarious position in terms of being able to govern AI effectively, because we don't have that sort of baseline set of protections that frankly most other countries have at this point, and certainly the European Union has. So that's one priority. A second priority would be, creating pathways for moving some of the types of protections that we saw come out through the executive order and then through the OMB memo, which is a memo that was issued after the executive order by the Office of Management and Budget, directing federal agencies to take specific steps to evaluate AI systems that they are using for rights protection and for safety infringements, and to not use those systems if they do not pass those basic evaluations. So we don't have anything like that in law, and those provisions in the OMB memo have the force of law within the government, but only around the government's own use of AI. So a second priority of an incoming administration would be to create pathways to move some of those evaluation and accountability measures for the use of AI systems into law in ways that are applied to the private sector and to private sector uses of AI. And then maybe a third thing that I will mention that I would love to see in an incoming administration is to take a very strong stance on the need for the government to be involved in creating a public AI infrastructure, to create both the technical infrastructure that would allow for publicly funded AI to happen, but also the AI research and development space, which right now is entirely concentrated or almost entirely concentrated in the private sector. So we really need to see a much more, I think, robust embrace of the idea that right now the concentration of power in the technology industry is foreclosing the ability to develop AI, to use AI in ways that advance the public interest rather than private interest.
Well, that's an excellent start, and I do acknowledge clearly a Harris administration set of approaches to this would be different from a Trump administration set of approaches. And also, I would go further and say, while you've talked a lot about privacy and safety, there are, the impacts of AI are not vertical or horizontal. They affect every agency in different kinds of ways, and that will be increasingly the case. Yeah. But let's talk about the differentiation a little bit, because as you noted, the Trump is surrounded by people who have a vested interest in this. It's in a way that we also have not seen before, because Elon Musk has an interest and an approach and is a big donor, to whom, in fact, Trump has outsourced a lot of his groundwork of his campaign. Mm-hmm. Peter Thiel is somebody else who is a towering figure in the AI world, has his own particular political views, and is supportive of Trump. And while both of them have had, made statements about warning about risks of AI and so forth, they do promote this view of AI laissez-faire. Let us handle this, folks. That is a very common view in Silicon Valley on everything. Mm-hmm. And, there is some merit to the view. Not that I've never thrown myself in the same political boat with them, but there is some merit to the view, because the level of understanding of AI issues is so low in Washington, mm-hmm. That, we're not sure how much value added there is here. When all you have to do is listen to a congressional hearing on this, and it's cringe, right? It's kind of embarrassing. So, let's just sort of explore where that leads us. Where does this kind of laissez-faire approach take the country, and what do you think the risks are?
I think there are real risks. My basic position is that ungoverned AI is a danger, and we have a lot of research and a lot of evidence to show that that's the case. The impacts of AI systems on, particularly on minoritized and historically vulnerable or disenfranchised groups, are more significant. We see more significant harms in those populations. And as I mentioned, right now, we really aren't seeing the kinds of enforcement and protections put in place that would, allow those populations and all of us really to be protected.
In areas such as like algorithmic discrimination or other areas?
For instance, algorithmic discrimination is, a cross-cutting issue in all kinds of areas, from, in criminal justice, in, risk assessment scoring in courts. Should a person be returned to jail, or should they be given an opportunity to post bail? In hiring, and who gets hired, who even gets the opportunity to be hired. We see the use of algorithmic systems and of AI in a huge range of areas that are connected to attempting to determine human outcomes, essentially. And we have very little evidence that AI is good for that it actually gives us information that is useful and that is predictive. And so that is one of the key concerns, I would say, of people who are looking to see AI be more effectively governed.
If I may interject there, one of the things that we've already seen is that people use AI to save time in highly pressurized situations, including the Israeli army using it to target Gaza, right? I mean, and what it does is it produces kind of enhanced speed of operations. And people say, well, we'll have human beings oversee all of this. And inevitably they don't. Inevitably what they do is they start trusting the AI to make these decisions. And there are a lot of situations where you could see that being an issue in the area that you're talking about, whether it's the criminal justice system, or it's the healthcare system, or it's regulatory applications, where people could use AI as a shortcut and therefore amplify the biases embedded in the AI.
That's right.
So that seems like a substantial area of risk. Another one, though, has to do with data privacy, where we just don't have a clear view on that on the planet Earth, where there's sort of three models, opting in and opting out, and the Chinese model, which is the government owns all of it. But as you say, in the United States, we even have a kind of a fragmented, crazy quilt set of regulations on this. The more AI is used, the more data is harvested, the more the owners of data really control data becomes the asset of the society. The greater the demand for these rules is. What would be the consequence of 4 years of an administration not making progress on this?
Well, I think we're there. I think we're living in it, which is that we have, we've been through multiple cycles of trying to get ourselves in the position of governing technology, right? We have been through this with data privacy as a continuing layer. We have been through it with social media. I'm sure you remember the mid 2010s when we had multiple congressional hearings where the heads of big social media platforms of Facebook and Google and so on were pulled into Washington to explain themselves, to explain the harms on their platforms. But nothing actually happened out of that. It was really kind of the political theater of, demanding but not requiring accountability. So I think what you're describing is lack of action on data privacy is indicative of sort of the larger, as you say, laissez-faire kind of approach that we've had to tech governance in the United States. And I think that's led us to a place where we're facing, a number of big problems that are not just constricting, our sort of vision of what AI could be or how we could use it, but I think really impacting democracy and impacting democratic practice, democratic representation, because we are operating in a situation with an incredible concentration of power in a single industry, a concentration of compute, of data, as you say, of talent and of money, of investment. And we don't have good countervailing power. We don't have strong enough labor unions to create countervailing power. We don't have a citizens movement. We don't have that, and the government has not stepped in to provide that countervailing power and assert a control over that industry in the way that we've seen in just about every other industry, right? We have a set of controls around, pharmaceuticals. We have a set of controls around the environment. Now, they may not be good enough, but we have a pattern for that. And what we've seen in around technology is a willingness to let the industry set the terms of debate, and a willingness to bend to the idea that the only public value that we need to prioritize is innovation in any direction at all costs. And I think that's led us to a really dangerous place.
Yes, no, there's no question about it. Now, you talked about the Biden administration, and I know a lot of the people who were involved in that process. I know you've been involved in that process, but we've had on the podcast even Ben Buchanan, Arthi Prabhakar, several of people. I worked with Arthi many years ago in the Commerce Department, even,
She's wonderful.
and she's a brilliant woman. But all of them, if you sit and chat with them, will say this was preliminary, right? That executive order was essentially, okay, let's get our ducks in a row. Everybody, every agency, you've got to go do something on this. But it didn't take us to the next step, which is what you've got to do. And in fact, one of the problems with AI is, as I said, it's horizontal, and what the Labor Department needs to do about dislocation of workers is different from what the Treasury Department has to do about potentially enhanced inequality, and very different from what DoD has to do about autonomous weapons platforms, right?
Yeah.
It's
highly contextual. It's highly contextual.
Right, because essentially what we're doing is you've got a bunch of people who think of technological innovation as their experience with the internet, where you solve the problem by getting a chief technology officer. And really what we're dealing with is the Industrial Revolution, which changes all of society in fundamental ways: how we work, how we interact with each other, what we do, how we define our lives, how economies work, and so forth. And so, you got to start somewhere. This was a good place to start. We could very well have the president from Silicon Valley, right? Kamala Harris, who worked and raised in the Bay Area, interacted with a lot of these donors. And she was deeply involved in a lot of our high-tech policy issues, particularly on the national security side. How do we compete with the Chinese? Yeah. Where are the issues, and so forth. But what is AI policy 1.1? Okay, we've said let's have a roadmap.
Mm-hmm.
Now what do we do in terms of the Chips and Science Act and where that should be taking us? Or what do we do in terms of competitiveness with China and where that should be taking us? Or what do we do in terms of protecting the unprotected in our
Mm-hmm.
society? One of my own favorite subjects, which nobody really wants to talk about, which is why I often sit alone at lunch just playing with the food on my plate, is that it might be a good idea to train policymakers
Mm-hmm.
to actually understand these issues
Mm-hmm.
before we have them making policy.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody goes, "Oh yeah, that's a good idea," but nobody wants to do it, with a few exceptions. For example, Don Beyer, Democrat from Virginia, went back to school and is getting his master's degree in AI, right? So, and Ted Lieu went to school. There are a few people out there who actually know something about this, but not a lot of them, right? So
Right.
I'm just wondering, what does, AI policy 1.1 or 2.0 look like for Kamala Harris? If you were saying to her, look, right, here's where the rubber meets the road, do this first, what would you say?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Gosh, so many things that need to be done, honestly. So I mean, I think maybe a couple of sort of high level points to frame what I would say
By
to
the way,
Vice President Harris.
inevitably in the government, at least in my experience of the government, when there's so many things to be done, the first thing they do is they say, okay, we need a czar. Okay, we have to have a government-wide AI czar.
Yeah,
Is
that
that
is.
a good idea? I mean,
No.
because often it's a really dumb idea, but
I mean, I think to your point, which I couldn't agree with more, David, that AI policymaking is highly contextual. I don't think that having a sort of single, overarching decider of all the things is a good idea at all. And part of that is because it's really important to remember that we use the term AI as shorthand, and it has fallen into sort of the policy realm that it is an object, the AI, but it isn't. Right? AI is many things. I mean, even if we create very big categories, when we talk about regulating AI, we have a lot more sort of concrete information and ideas and policy really around how we regulate predictive AI as opposed to generative AI. And so those kinds of technical differences are significant and are not always built meaningfully into the ways that we talk about or think about our reactions to it. So that's kind of one piece, and then I would say on the second piece, in terms of the issue of context. One of the things that we do at Data and Society, or really the main thing that we do, is that we study the social and cultural and political impacts of these systems. So we are not focused on the technical side of these systems, which it's good that there are people who are. We're focused on what we think of as the socio-technical. That is where society and technology meet and how they interact at the societal level, at the community level, at the individual level. And so, what we see, for instance, in the AI research and development space, that is, both federally funded and privately funded, is that there is enormous investment in the technical development of AI. But there is very, very little development and very, very little research into the societal impacts of those systems, in doing on the ground research to really understand, what does it mean when we put automated systems into a warehouse for the workers that are working in that warehouse? How does it change their health? How does it change their agency as people? How does it change job dignity, job quality? How does it change their sense of being surveilled and tracked? And is that the kind of environment that we want to create? We are about to embark on a project that's actually funded by the National Science Foundation, looking at the environmental impacts of AI. So looking at the environmental impacts of data centers. What we are studying is not going to be about essentially the energy consumption or the water consumption of those data centers, which is significant and should absolutely be studied. What we're interested in studying is the impacts of those data centers on the communities that are around those places. How are they being impacted? How are their kids being impacted? What does it look like to compete for resources with a gigantic new facility that has come into your community? And so that is the kind of research, and this is a very small project, right? That is the kind of research that I think we need to see more of to inform policymakers. So when you talk about educating policymakers, I think that's right, although I would contend that the Biden administration brought fantastic people in who really do know what they're talking about and have done significant and I think really groundbreaking work in developing governance strategies for AI. But I agree that we need to continue to build the government's capacity in this. We need to continue to educate policymakers. But I think a lot of that is that we need to provide actionable evidence that actually gives them information about the trade-offs and choices in designing different kinds of governance approaches. Because if we don't understand the impact of these systems on people and their lived experiences, on teachers, on kids, on people living around data centers, on workers, on truck drivers, we really can't govern very effectively. We're governing in a technical bubble, which does not take into account what really happens when these systems are put out into the world.
I think it's an excellent point. I will start as you did by just offering a slight disagreement with one of your elements, which is I think the Biden administration did bring in some great people at the center. But in my outreach to many of the agencies, that's not true. And that a lot of the agencies are quite shallow in this regard, and many of them have adopted I've got somebody for that approach, which is not, I think, successful. So that, this is an early phase of these kind of changes. Mm-hmm. But I think your broader point really resonates with me because as I've said in talks and also in stuff I've written, I always wonder where the philosophers are at the table, because this is going to bring about profound questions about the nature of life, the nature of work, the nature of identity, the nature of society, what is just, what is not just, and so forth. And we saw this. We saw it with the Industrial Revolution, as I often say. It began in 1776. You could trace it to that moment. James Watt patented a version of the steam engine in 1776. And Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And of course, we have the Declaration of Independence. And if you go forward for the first sort of 50 years of this, it takes you to Karl Marx and a discussion about the nature of capital and technology, the means of production and so forth, a discussion that is going to have to be revisited in this period. And you understand that as there was all of this industrial ferment, there was a kind of philosophical ferment about what does this mean to us as a society. And the advantage of all that was it took 50 years. And this is going to take 5 years. This is going to happen much, much faster. And we need to really focus on the kind of things you're focusing on. So I'm going to put my stake in the ground right now because we've run out of time, that I'd love to have you come back and talk about socio-technical side of this thing.
I'd love to.
Because that to me is really where the rubber meets the road. And by the way, we've had a number of recent podcasts where we've been talking about the global South and how they feel disenfranchised from this. And, there is this idea of, them becoming, data slaves
right.
and I think that is also an area that's rich, and vitally important to discuss now. In fact, just this week, President of Brazil made a statement saying that they want to be at the table, that the countries of the global South want to be at the table in making the global rules on this because they fear this, right? And so there is a lot to discuss there, and I hope we come back. But in our last 30 seconds, and I say it's 30 seconds because I'm making this up as I go, I do have another question, because at the very beginning of this episode, I learned that you actually were friends with my sister, which I did not know.
I am friends with your sister.
Who some of our listeners may know actually does a podcast for us called The Secret Life of Cookies.
Yeah.
And so immediately, as you were talking, and I didn't mean to be rude, but I was texting her and I said, like, what up? Here's Janet Haven. She's on the show. And she said, ask her about honey brown butter chocolate chip cookies. Go on, ask her. She tested the recipe.
And I tested the recipe this weekend.
And?
Amazing. I mean, I will say these are the best chocolate chip cookies I have ever made myself or eaten. And your sister is putting a book out on chocolate chip cookies, and I just think everybody should buy it.
Well, I strongly agree with that. I don't want to have to support her in her old age. Although I'm somewhat older, so I probably wouldn't have to. But I was saying to her actually this morning that it's just not fair, because I write about national security, and I at a party and I say, oh, I've got some very interesting opinions on national security, and people go, that's great, I've got to go get a drink, and she's going to go, oh, I've just written a book on chocolate chip cookies, and people are going to go, let's talk. I love that. You're bringing joy to the world. I mean, you should be jealous. When you say you talk about AI, they're like, okay, well, it's important.
People just glaze over, really.
Right.
Yeah, no.
Right. But she's talking about cookies.
The center of everything.
Yeah, exactly.
But the brown butter honey chocolate chip cookies are ace.
Ace. So there you have it, folks. More than you expected from this episode of Siliconsciousness. But what you needed about AI policy, about what's about to happen in Washington, and about honey brown butter chocolate chip cookies. Thank you, Janet. Really glad to have you here. Hopefully we'll come back and have the second part of this conversation. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Come back for all the podcasts we do here at the DSR Network each and every day. We've got coming a little later today our team of political insiders, Simon Rosenberg, Tara McGowan, and so forth, to talk about where we are 19 days out from the election. You don't want to miss that. Maybe you do want to miss it, but you shouldn't miss it. And so join us for that. Until then, thanks, everybody.